Welcome. You've chosen to spend some time drifting through the past, in the company of history that is as strange as it is distant. This is not a hurried journey. It is a slow passage through memory, through fragments of lives that once were. Tonight, we step into the world of ancient Rome, into marble halls, echoing chambers, and the quiet hum of a society both familiar and alien to our own. Our focus will be the reign of one of history's most infamous rulers, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better remembered by his nickname, Caligula. His reputation has lived on in whispers of scandal, excess, and cruelty. His name often comes up when people think of emperors who embodied corruption, indulgence, and madness. But tonight, we will not shout or dramatize those stories. We will not treat them as lurid entertainment. Instead, we will unfold them gently, carefully, as though reading by candlelight. You may find yourself lulled into sleep by the rhythm of daily life in his empire, or perhaps you will linger awake, quietly fascinated by how far removed these customs feel, and yet how deeply human they remain. The tale is structured in 4 long movements. First, we will immerse ourselves in daily Roman life, so you can picture the backdrop against which Caligula's infamous behaviors unfolded. We will wander through streets, marketplaces, and quiet villas, to understand the rhythms of ordinary existence. From there, we will turn to biography, to the life of Caligula himself. We will explore the shaping of his character, the court he ruled over, and the acts that made him notorious. The third portion will draw us into the cultural and ritual world of Rome, the mystery, the strange customs, the religious ceremonies, and the atmosphere of decadent experimentation that framed the emperor's choices. Finally, we will contrast the elite's indulgent lives with those of Rome's common citizens, who labored, dreamed, and endured under the shadow of imperial power. This is not a story told to excite or alarm, but one meant to soothe, to intrigue gently, and perhaps to help your mind drift softly into sleep. Imagine yourself stepping into the city of Rome in the early decades of the 1st century, under the soft light of dawn. The cobblestones are cool and slightly damp with morning air, and the faint smell of smoke from hearth fires curls upward, mixing with the salty tang drifting inland from the sea. The city is alive, but not yet noisy. Vendors begin arranging their wares in the markets, figs stacked carefully in woven baskets, amphorae filled with wine, jars of honey glinting in the light. Bakers open their ovens, pulling out warm loaves with crisp crusts. The scent of fresh bread travels down narrow alleyways, winding between tall insulae, the apartment blocks where many Romans lived. For most Romans, life was not defined by emperors or scandals, but by the rhythms of work, meals, worship, and survival. Children played games in the courtyards, tossing small bones like dice. Women tended to weaving, spinning wool into long threads, or managing the household stores of oil and grain. Men might head to work in workshops, construction sites, or in service to wealthier households. The empire stretched vast and wide, and Rome itself was the hub where cultures mingled. You might hear Greek spoken at one stall, Latin at another, Egyptian or Syrian words drifting nearby. The water system of Rome brought fresh flow into fountains scattered throughout the city. Imagine walking to one of these fountains with a clay jar, the sound of water spilling steadily from carved stone mouths. People exchanged quiet greetings, speaking of weather, of prices at the market, of the latest races in the circus. The grand structures of Rome, the Forum, the Palatine Hill, the temples, loomed above daily errands, reminders of Rome's might. But alongside grandeur were struggles. Many lived crowded in upper floors of tenements, where water was scarce and fires a constant risk. Nights could be restless, with the sounds of carts, animals, and restless voices drifting through open shutters. Disease moved easily in such close quarters. The rich, meanwhile, had homes with inner courtyards, atriums where sunlight poured in, where meals were taken reclining on couches, served by household slaves. Food was central to Roman daily life, though diets varied widely. A poorer family might rely on bread, porridge, olives, and the occasional fish or vegetable stew. Wealthier households enjoyed more variety: roasted meats, shellfish, exotic fruits from the far reaches of the empire, and wines seasoned with spices and herbs. Imagine sitting at a low table, tasting grapes still firm and sweet, or sipping watered wine from a simple cup. Entertainment filled spare hours. Theaters staged plays, though not every day. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew enormous crowds, cheering as teams of horses thundered past, wheels rattling over the track. Gladiatorial games, though brutal, were moments of spectacle. Yet in the evenings, ordinary Romans might simply gather with neighbors, sharing stories or music, perhaps a quiet song plucked on a lyre. Religion also wove itself into the fabric of daily life. Small household shrines, laria, stood in corners of homes, where incense might be burned, or offerings of fruit placed before tiny figurines of household gods. Public festivals filled the calendar, giving rhythm and meaning to the year. Processions, sacrifices, and ceremonies tied the people of Rome together, connecting them to traditions centuries old. And above all this ordinary life, the emperor reigned. His presence was distant from many, felt mostly in decrees, taxes, or public works. Yet rumors trickled down about his behavior, his speeches, his indulgences. These whispers would become louder in the years of Caligula, but for now, the city continued on in its rhythms. The cobblestones echoed with footsteps, the air smelled of bread and oil, the sky brightened over marble temples, and life unfolded in the eternal city. As you picture this, bustling markets, crowded tenements, sunlit villas, and shadowed shrines, remember that it was here, in this vibrant, restless city, that Caligula rose to power. His rituals, his choices, and his excesses were set against this backdrop of ordinary daily struggle and quiet endurance. Let us now, slowly, move from this wider view of Roman daily life into the narrower path of one man's story, the young emperor himself, Caligula, and the strange rituals that would one day make his name synonymous with excess. So, let us begin our long walk into the heart of ancient Rome. Imagine, for a moment, the palace chambers of the Julio Claudian dynasty. These were not simply homes, but labyrinths of power, intrigue, and whispered secrets. In this setting, in the year 12 C, a child was born in Antium, a coastal town not far from Rome. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But history remembers him by a nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots. The story of that name is almost gentle in contrast to the infamy he would later gather. His father, Germanicus, was one of Rome's most beloved generals, a man adored by the legions he commanded. When Gaius was very young, he was dressed in miniature versions of the military uniform, tiny sandals or caligae that Roman soldiers wore. The soldiers, amused and charmed, called him Caligula, their little boot. What began as an affectionate nickname, spoken by battle-hardened men, would cling to him forever. Caligula's early years were shaped by both privilege and peril. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a strong-willed and proud woman, a granddaughter of Augustus, the first emperor. Through her, Caligula carried the bloodline of the founder of Rome's imperial system. Yet with that blood came dangers. The political climate of Rome during his childhood was heavy with suspicion. Emperor Tiberius, his great-uncle, grew increasingly paranoid as he aged. Germanicus, Caligula's father, died when the boy was just 7 years old, under circumstances many suspected to be poisoned. For Caligula, this meant a childhood touched by loss, and by the sense that those closest to him could be destroyed by forces beyond his understanding. After Germanicus's death, Agrippina and her children found themselves in an uneasy position. Tiberius, suspicious of their popularity, watched them closely. Eventually, Caligula was separated from much of his family. His mother and 2 brothers were accused of treason and exiled. All 3 would die in exile, starved or neglected. Caligula, however, was spared. He was brought instead to live under the direct eye of Tiberius. This period of his life, growing up in the emperor's household on the island of Capri, is shrouded in mystery. Ancient sources describe Tiberius's court as decadent, filled with dark practices and sinister pleasures. Whether these reports were exaggerated or not, one can imagine the impression it left on a boy in his adolescence. A place where power was absolute, where cruelty could masquerade as amusement, and where indulgence blurred into corruption. For years, Caligula remained quiet, careful, cautious. He learned the art of survival in an environment where a careless word could mean death. Suetonius, the Roman biographer, described him as outwardly compliant, but inwardly filled with hidden resentment. He bided his time. When Tiberius died in the year 37 CE, the succession fell to Caligula. He was just 24 years old. At first, his rise was greeted with joy. The Roman people remembered his father, Germanicus, with affection, and they welcomed the young man as a symbol of hope. In those first months, his reign seemed almost golden. He granted amnesties, recalled exiles, and held games and spectacles for the people. Rome celebrated him, perhaps imagining a return to gentler rule. But soon, shadows fell across this hopeful beginning. Ancient writers suggest that Caligula suffered from an illness not long after taking power, an illness that nearly killed him. When he recovered, they claimed, his mind was changed. Whether this was truly the turning point or merely a convenient tale, it is certain that the rest of his reign would be marked by behaviors that shocked, unsettled, and fascinated Rome. He began to spend lavishly, draining the treasury on games, temples, and personal projects. He demanded honors that stretched the limits of Roman tradition, asking to be worshipped not only as emperor, but as a living god. His actions toward senators and nobles became cruel and humiliating, reminding them that their dignity was subject to his whims. And woven through all of this were the rituals and behaviors that gave him his most enduring reputation. Stories of banquets that blurred the lines between feasting and sacrilege, of relationships that ignored the boundaries of family, of ceremonies that seemed designed to shock rather than to honor the gods. We must remember, of course, that much of what we know of Caligula comes from hostile sources. Roman historians often painted him in the darkest possible colors. Yet, even allowing for exaggeration, the themes that emerge are clear: excess, indulgence, and a disregard for the norms that anchored Roman society. As you picture this, imagine him in the palace, draped in fine silks, surrounded by marble columns and flickering torchlight. Servants moving quietly, senators waiting nervously, musicians playing softly in the background. And in the center of it all, the emperor, restless, unpredictable, indulging in rituals that blurred the sacred and the profane. This was Caligula, the child nicknamed for his little boots, who grew up in the shadows of suspicion, who rose to supreme power, and who came to embody the dangerous intoxication of unchecked rule. In the next part of our journey, we will step away from the man himself and turn to the broader cultural canvas of Rome, the mysteries, the rituals, and the traditions that shaped his world, and within which his own strange ceremonies took place. Picture, for a moment, the Sacred Heart of Rome. The air thick with incense, temple steps worn smooth by countless feet, and processions winding through streets to honor the gods. Rituals were woven into every layer of Roman life. From small household offerings to grand sacrifices in the Forum, religion was not separate from politics, nor from daily existence. It was the thread that bound the city together. Romans believed the gods were ever present, watching, guiding, punishing. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, each had their shrines, their rites, their days. A successful harvest, a military victory, even the birth of a healthy child, all depended on the favor of these divine powers. To secure such favor, rituals were exact, precise. Priests, dressed in flowing robes, intoned prayers that had to be spoken without error, lest the ceremony lose its power. Animals were led to altars, their lives offered as tokens to maintain the balance between human and divine. Within this world of reverence, emperors themselves began to blur the line between man and God. Augustus, the first emperor, had been careful. He allowed honors but resisted being openly worshipped in Rome during his lifetime. Tiberius, Caligula's predecessor, followed suit. But Caligula, he leaned into the divine role more boldly, demanding recognition not simply as a ruler favored by the gods, but as a god incarnate. Imagine the disquiet this stirred. Rome was accustomed to reverence, but not to such living arrogance. Temples were rededicated in Caligula's name. Statues of gods were altered, their faces replaced with his. He is said to have dressed as Apollo, as Venus, even as Jupiter, parading himself in divine costume. At feasts, he sat in the pose of a deity, expecting guests to honor him not as emperor, but as immortal. And then there were the banquets, lavish, drawn out, and unsettling in their excess. Roman banquets were normally elaborate affairs. Guests reclined on couches, courses of meats, seafood, fruits, and pastries flowed endlessly. Musicians played, conversations drifted. But under Caligula, the feasts became something more like theater. He staged them as rituals of his own invention, where boundaries were deliberately blurred. Ancient writers whisper of tables laid with gold, dishes so extravagant they seem to mock the simplicity of earlier traditions. Yet more than the food, it was the atmosphere, the sense that dining itself had become a ceremony of dominance. Guests were made to feel uneasy, compelled to laugh when he laughed, to praise when he commanded, to witness acts that turned sacred customs upside down. Some accounts speak of Caligula turning even marriage and intimacy into public rituals. Weddings, normally private bonds sealed with sacred words, were interrupted or reshaped under his whims. He is said to have taken brides from their grooms' sides, treating their unions as performances in his theater of power. The sanctity of family, so revered in Rome, was cast aside, as if to remind everyone that even their most intimate traditions were subject to the emperor's hand. We cannot know how much of this is precisely true, and how much was magnified by hostile historians. But even softened, the picture remains. A man who used ritual not as a bridge to the divine, but as a stage for himself. He blurred boundaries, between feast and sacrifice, between marriage and spectacle, between worship and mockery. One tale tells of Caligula ordering bridges built across water simply so he could ride his horse as if a god walking across the sea. Another recalls his insistence that his beloved horse, Incitatus, be honored as a priest, even prepared to be made consul, a gesture that mingled jest with sacrilege, undermining the solemnity of Rome's political traditions. In all these acts, whether exaggerated or real, we see a consistent pattern, the transformation of ritual into theater, of ceremony into indulgence. Rome's culture, steeped in reverence and tradition, became under Caligula's rule a canvas for his own self-deification. As you imagine this, picture the torchlight flickering against marble walls, the smell of incense heavy in the air, music echoing softly, and the emperor seated in divine costume. Around him, nervous senators, reluctant priests, and uncertain guests, all drawn into a ritual they did not believe, but dared not resist. The boundaries of the sacred had shifted, and the emperor stood at the center, both man and, in his own mind, God. These were the ceremonies of Caligula, perverse not because they were bloody or chaotic, but because they inverted meaning. They transformed Rome's most sacred traditions into mirrors reflecting his own power. In the final movement of our journey, we will turn away from palaces and temples, and return once more to the lives of ordinary Romans. We will contrast the emperor's indulgences with the quiet endurance of the common people, those who lived, worked, and dreamed under his shadow. Imagine once more the crowded streets of Rome. Beyond the marbled palaces, beyond the echoing halls where Caligula staged his ceremonies, life for most Romans continued in a steady rhythm. The cobblestones were worn by sandals, the fountains flowed with water from aqueducts, and in cramped apartments above the street, families cooked, ate, and slept in narrow spaces. For the majority of the city's inhabitants, life was marked not by ritual excess, but by constant balance between survival and small pleasures. A poor family might wake to a simple meal of bread dipped in olive oil. The father might work at a trade, stone cutting, carpentry, or hauling goods through the market. Children would scurry through alleys, laughing and playing games with pebbles and sticks, while mothers tended to spinning wool, bargaining at stalls, or fetching water. The noise of the city was ever present, the creak of carts, the braying of animals, the cries of merchants offering figs, cheese, or fish. The air carried a mixture of scents, baked bread, hot oil, damp stone, and in less fortunate corners, the sharper odors of waste and refuse. In contrast, the emperor and his circle lived surrounded by luxury. Palaces opened into vast courtyards lined with statues, gardens perfumed with roses, fountains pouring endlessly. Their meals were served on dishes of silver and gold, their conversations carried out in chambers where every surface reflected wealth. For the elite, life was not a struggle for survival, but a performance of status. The gulf between these two worlds was immense, yet they coexisted in the same city. A poor family might catch glimpses of the emperor only during festivals or parades, when Caligula appeared in glittering robes, perhaps even in the guise of a god. For them, he was both distant and immediate, distant in his unattainable luxury, immediate in the taxes they paid, in the decrees that shaped their daily lives. Work defined the lower classes, while leisure defined the higher. Senators debated policy, but also dined for hours in reclining comfort. Wealthy women displayed jewels and silks, while poor women measured each coin at the market, calculating carefully what might last until the next day. And yet, even in hardship, the common Romans found moments of joy. Festivals punctuated the year, Saturnalia with its feasting and role reversals, or the games in the Circus Maximus where, for a few hours, all eyes followed the chariots racing in a blur of hooves and dust. Neighbors shared food when they could, songs and stories echoed in courtyards, and in the evenings, the hum of conversation drifted through open windows. Religion offered solace as well. Small shrines in homes glowed with flickering lamps, the Laras and Penates, household gods, watching silently over each family. Prayers were whispered not for grandeur, but for health, safety, and enough food to last the season. Against this backdrop, Caligula's excesses seemed all the more distant, even unreal. Ordinary Romans may have heard rumors of his banquets, his divine costumes, his strange rituals. But for them, the pressing concerns were humbler: a leaky roof, the price of grain, the hope that a child might grow strong. This contrast, between the emperor who saw himself as a god and the people who prayed simply for daily bread, is one of the enduring images of Rome. It reminds us that history is not only the story of rulers, but of countless anonymous lives that endured beneath their rule. Imagine, then, drifting through the city at night. The torches in the forum flicker, the sounds of the day fade into silence, and behind shuttered windows, both the rich and the poor find sleep. In a villa, a noble reclines on cushions, the air scented with perfumes. In an insula, a family huddles together against the chill. Different worlds, yet bound together in the same city, under the same moon, beneath the reign of the same emperor. As our long journey nears its end, let us gently reflect on this contrast. The emperor's life was a stage of spectacle, but the lives of ordinary Romans, quiet, resilient, and unrecorded, were the true rhythm of the city, and so, our quiet walk through history draws to a close. We began by wandering the streets of ancient Rome, where the scents of bread and oil mingled with the smoke of morning fires, and where the rhythm of ordinary life continued, steady, enduring, and endlessly human. We saw the markets, the insulae, the fountains, and the shrines, the daily existence of countless men, women, and children whose names are lost, yet whose presence shaped the eternal city. From there, we turned our gaze to the emperor himself, Caligula, once the child in little boots, later the ruler draped in the garments of gods. We traced his path through loss and suspicion, from his father's celebrated campaigns to the dark court of Tiberius, and finally to his own throne. In him, we saw how the concentration of power can both elevate and distort, shaping a man into a figure remembered for excess and strangeness. We lingered among Rome's rituals and ceremonies, once sacred, precise, and binding, then transformed under Caligula's hand into something unsettling, theatrical, and self-serving. Where others sought the favor of gods, he sought to be a god. Where rites once honored tradition, they became mirrors reflecting his power and whims. And at last, we returned to the people, to the men and women who lived beneath marble columns and above crowded cobblestones. We contrasted the emperor's indulgences with their humble needs: bread, work, laughter, prayer, and hope. In them, we found a quiet strength, a resilience that outlived even the most notorious rulers. History often remembers the loudest figures: the emperors, the generals, the scandals. Yet as we drift through these memories, it is worth remembering that the fabric of the past was woven just as much by the ordinary and the anonymous. For every torchlit banquet in a palace, there were 1,000 suppers of bread and oil in modest homes. For every ritual of excess, there were countless whispered prayers at small household shrines. And so, as you rest now, let these echoes fade gently into silence. The marble halls grow dim, the streets of Rome quiet under the moonlight. The emperor's voice fades into history, while the steady rhythm of ordinary lives continues, timeless and enduring. Perhaps you find yourself reflecting on the comfort of your own life, on the safety of your home, the softness of your bed, the warmth that shields you from the uncertainties of the past. The world of Caligula, with all its excess and strangeness, is far away. What remains is the calm knowledge that history has passed, and you are here in peace. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the hum of Rome dissolve into stillness, the clatter of carts into quiet, the flicker of torches into darkness. Allow the past to recede, like a tide withdrawing from the shore. And sleep, softly, under the gentle weight of history.